We are going to take a look at indexers. And um, basically, an indexer is a property that can store multiple values that you index into, similar to an array. In fact, they are called smart arrays. And so the way that you create them is a little bit different. You have to use the regular property syntax. So you do have to declare the private property, and the data type is going to have brackets after it, similar to how you declare an array. Then you're going to set that equal to new and whatever the data type is, and then you have to give it the size of the array. Okay, and then you have to use regular property syntax for the get and the set. And so you've got your access modifier here, your return data type, and that's more for your get method. And then instead of the property name, you have to use the keyword this, and then in brackets is the argument list. And that is typically going to be your index. And so it's helpful to see an example here. So here I've got a private property called names. It's a string. So I've kind of declared it like a string array. I've got it equal to new string and the size is 5. Okay, and then you'll see that in the regular property syntax here, I've got the keyword this, and then in brackets, this integer is going to be used as an index. So for the get, I have to index in and retrieve a name from the list and return that. And for the set, remember that the value is automatically passed, so I don't need a parameter list for it. So that comes in, and then I've got my little array here, my indexer, that I index into, and I place the value at that location. So some key points to remember about indexers is that you have to create the property with the keyword this. Okay, you can't put a capital N and use names here. It has to be the keyword this. Parameterized properties are called indexers. Indexers are implemented through get and set accessors for the bracket operator. Ref and out parameter modifiers are not permitted. If this isn't a class, it is a reference variable anyway, or a reference object. Formal parameter list of an indexer corresponds to that of a method, and at least one parameter should be specified. So the parameter that is typically specified is the index value. Indexers are used on a group of elements, right? So we have a group of names. That's why we're using an indexer. An indexer is identified by its signature, whereas a property is identified by its name. This is the signature. So you see the keyword this, you see an integer coming in, you know that this is an indexer. Indexers are accessed using indices, whereas properties are accessed by names. And an indexer can be overloaded. So using an indexer, since we talked about how to create it, now how do we use it? So we have to create a class object, and that's kind of the same way we've done it all along. Okay, and then to add the data to our indexer, we take our object and we use the brackets just like we would in an array, and then we give it our index number. So this is the location in that indexer where we want to put the values. And then if we want to retrieve values, it's very similar to an array, right? We just index into the property and it will retrieve it for us. So here is a full programming example. So you can see I did do a static property where I set the size to 5, and then I used that to create my name indexer. You can see I've got a constructor. What I had to do in the constructor then is I had to kind of loop through my name indexer and set each one to empty. Now, this is really important because you have to initialize it or you can't use it. Okay, so everything gets set to empty. And then for my property syntax, I have to use the keyword this. And here I am bringing in a value for the index. And then here is my get and my set method. So for my get method, I create a little temporary string that I'm calling temp. And I'm checking the index basically to make sure that it is valid. And so if it is valid, I can retrieve the name, put it into temp. If it's not valid, I'm just retrieving a space. And then whatever I put into temp gets returned. And then for set, again, I am making sure that index is valid. And as long as it's valid, I'm taking the value and I am putting it into my name indexer. Okay, and so here is another little longer example where I'm creating a team object. I've got a Boolean variable called end that I set to false, and I'm going to stay in the loop as long as basically as long as it's not true. So as long as it's false. So then I've got a subscript and I'm checking that number to make sure it's valid. And you can see I set it to 0 purposefully so it wouldn't be valid so that I can say what team member do you want to set? And then I make sure that it's a integer. If it's not, I prompt them to enter the value. So basically what this does is it makes sure that they're entering an integer, and this little outer loop is making sure that the integer is between 1 and 5. Okay, and then I'm entering the team member, reading that in. And with an indexer, it works similar to an array. So the first position is position 0. So I subtract 1 from the subscript that they specified. And so if they entered a 1, it's going to go into the indexer in position 0. Okay, and then I've got any key to continue, Q to stop, read that in. If they typed in a Q, it's the end. Otherwise, we just stay in the loop. Once we're out of the loop, okay, we are looping through and writing out each member of the team. Okay, so that's the first example. The second example, and if you wanted to write these or run these, you can. Okay, this will run as is. You can copy and paste it into Visual Studio. This next example, you can see that I have other properties in here besides the indexer. So I did set a constant field called size. This becomes a global variable when I set it outside of the class here. And then you can see I've set family members, which is my indexer. That is private. Everything else, I am using the auto implemented property. So I've got address, city, and state. And then for the constructor, it makes the constructor a little bit more complicated because each one of the index locations, the elements, has to be set to string empty. So I've got to loop through this and set all 15 of these to string empty. And then I can set address, city, and state to string empty. And then address, city, and state, C# is going to generate the get and set methods for me. But for my indexer, I have to generate it. So that is what public string this is doing. And this kind of looks like the other one that I showed you, where I've got a temporary string that I create. I check the index to make sure that it has a valid number. And if it does, I retrieve whatever text is in that location. Otherwise, I put a blank into temp and I return either the family member or a blank. For the set, I'm making sure that the index is valid, and then I'm taking the value and I am putting that into the indexer. Okay, and so here is my main method. So if you look, I did a family class. So here's my class. I'm calling it the duck family. Okay, and it is going to go through the default constructor. And I set end to false, so we'll stay in the loop until they want to quit. Okay, I'm doing the same thing for the getting that index number, which I'm calling sub. I've got this kind of a dual while loop. So the inner loop is basically making sure that it's an integer, and the outer loop is making sure that it's basically going to be between 1 and 15. So I've got size that it's looking at, which is my constant. Okay, and so it's just making sure that I have a valid number. Then once I have a valid number, we're entering the name of the family member, reading that in, and we're placing it into the indexer. Okay, we're asking them if they want to keep going. If they do quit, we end out of the loop. Okay, and so this whole loop is designed to fill in the indexer, the family members. Okay, once those family members are filled in, well, then we can fill in the rest, right? What's the family street address? You know, we can read that in. What city? We can read that in. What state? We can read that in. And then we can print everything out. And so when we print everything out, again, because we've got the indexer, we need to do a for loop on that. And there's no requirement in here that says they have to enter 15 family members. They could enter 2 and decide to quit. So when we're printing out, we want to make sure that the location in the indexer is not equal to string.empty. So as long as there's a value there, we'll print it out. But if they decided only to enter 2 family members, that's all we want to print. We don't want to print a bunch of blank lines. Okay, so that's why we're doing this little check here. And then you can see that we're going to print out the address, city, and state. Okay, and so here's a little sample run so you can see. We did Donald and Daisy and Scrooge McDuck and their little duck family. Okay, so here are the family members, their address, and all of that fun information. Okay, and the reason I wanted you guys just to go through this instead of reading the chapter is the chapter's examples I thought were a little confusing. thought these were a little simpler to understand because the concept of an indexer, it's really not that difficult. It's just like an array. So it's like it's just a property that lets you store multiple values. That's all it is.